I'm very happy to have you, Professor Bienkowski, and this time we're going to talk more about your excavation in Jordan and Southern Levant. You had the opportunity to work with Crystal Bennett, one of
That's
legendary
right.
figures.
She was legendary, wasn't she? Yes.
Yeah, yeah, she was one of very prominent British archaeologists that operated in Levant, and how, I mean, what was like, what this collaboration was like when you began working with her in 1970s and 1980s?
Well, I met her in 1979. I was working on an excavation in North Syria. I was still a student, and it was my first excavation in the region. And she came to visit. And during that visit, I talked to her, and she said she was planning to have her final season of excavations at the major administrative site of Busayra, just south of the Dead Sea, the following year. And she asked if I'd like to come. And that all sounded very exciting. I'd not been to Jordan before, so I agreed. And so the following year, in the summer of 1980, I was one of the site supervisors on her final season at Busera. And for a few years after that, I continued working with her, both working on post-excavation analysis and pottery drawing and things like that. And I also worked with her at a final season of excavations at the site of Tawilan, just outside Petra, both of them Iron Age sites. So I got on with her um, very well. She was a great organizer, a great administrator. In those days, the way you got things done, I mean, this was the late 70s, the early 80s. The way you got things done in Jordan was very, very different. Whenever she had any problems, she would just get on the telephone either to King Hussein or to to the Crown Prince and say, please sort this problem out for me. um, and I often thought that she didn't really see herself as a scholar. She was a great administrator and she organized these excavations, but she managed to produce preliminary reports on all of them, but she didn't manage to produce a final report on any of her excavations, whether it was her Iron Age excavations or her excavations on Amman Citadel. It's almost as if that part of the work didn't interest her that much, or it was so much effort. She always had better things to do. It's also true that at the time I knew her, sort of the early 1980s, she was already not very well. And there was quite a lot of time when I was working with her in Amman where she'd spent whole days or several days in bed. Um, and part of my job wasn't just doing post excavation; it was checking to see that she was all right.
Of course.
And she died, I mean, relatively young. She died in 1987. And because I'd been working on her excavations, I'd excavated twice with her, and I'd worked on post-excavation analysis. I was approached by, well, what was then the British Institute at Amman for Archaeology and History. It's now known as the Council for British Research in the Levant. I was approached by them and by her son to do the publication of her three Iron Age sites, so El Biara, Tawilan, and Busera. I was already working in a museum then, so it gave me a sort of institutional backing to be able to take that task on. And rather naively, I mean, let's see, she died in 1987. So rather naively, I thought that, oh, I'll manage to do all these three publications in about 7 years. That was my initial estimate. Well, in the end, it took me 23 years
Yeah.
to do the whole lot, from the
Oh,
first one to the last one, just because A, there's a lot of work, B, other things intervene, other things that are
of
called
course.
life.
Of
But
course.
in the end, I got them all done. I published Tawilan in 1995, Busera in 2002, and Biara in 2011. And I was also doing my own projects and excavations sort of alongside. It's another reason why it took me a bit longer, and I continue to work in Jordan today.
What do you think about Busayra? How impactful is that site for the history of Edomite kingdom, and how many people know about Busayra, and how well it's escalated? Recently, I was talking with Professor Porter, an American
Yes,
scholar who also worked at Busayra. Maybe you know each other, but how Busayra
yes,
is?
yes.
Yes, please go ahead.
Well, I mean, in terms of its importance as a site,
Yeah.
it is unique in Edom. And just to clarify for your listeners, by Edom we mean the Iron Age kingdom in the south of Jordan, south of the Dead Sea. Um, the the dates when Edom began are perhaps debated, but it certainly flourished from the late 8th century BC until the Persian period. So it's unique as a site. There's no other site like it in Edom. It's certainly the biggest site. The sort of architecture you've got there, sort of monumental architecture, recalling some Assyrian influence, is found nowhere else in Edom at all. And most people agree that Busayra should be identified with the Botzra of the Hebrew Bible, which is it's not called the capital in the Hebrew Bible, but in context, it was certainly the most important administrative site and the site where the king lived. So in effective terms, it was the capital. So it's certainly a very important site, and the reason why Crystal wanted to excavate there. One thing we have to remember is that the excavations that have been carried out there have only been in the central administrative part, almost like on the raised part of the mound of Busayra, partly because even in the 1970s, when Crystal started there, already the modern village um, had covered and was using some of what was probably the extension of the Iron Age site. And anybody who's been to Busera recently will know that the village is now expanded actually to a huge town. I was there a few months ago. I'd not been there for a little while, and honestly, I didn't recognize it. It's changed so much in the years since I dug there with Crystal. So it's difficult to know exactly how wide the ancient site of Busera was. What is excavated are those central major buildings, tentatively identified as a palace and a temple, and then a gateway and part of the wall, and some private houses that were nevertheless very close to those administrative buildings. It's likely that it extended much further under the modern town. Exactly how far we don't know, and therefore it's likely that originally the site was not just an administrative centre, but it was also a place where ordinary people lived. In terms of how well it was excavated, when I published the final report on the site, I did have to be very honest, say that there were some things that I wasn't able to untangle from the documentation, especially from Crystal's earlier excavations, partly because things were done differently in those days. She very often worked with people who weren't that experienced. She didn't necessarily train them. She wasn't there all the time, and therefore the notebooks don't always make clear what the context of something is. You don't necessarily know what the sequence of occupation is. You don't necessarily know which levels a particular wall or particular finds might be related to. So this was one of the big difficulties I had when I was publishing that site. Nevertheless, what I tried to do is publish material that I could be certain of. Where I really wasn't certain, I said, I can't do any more with this because I just don't know. But we did manage to produce a publication where we have a pretty good idea of the architecture and the context of some of the buildings. And what was very significant was that we found that occupation of Busayra actually extended well into the Persian period. In fact, probably to the end of the Persian period, if not beyond. And this was quite a unique discovery at the time. We know now that not only in Edom, but throughout the whole of Jordan, you've got continuity from the Iron Age through to the Persian period. At the time, even when I was producing the final report, that wasn't really appreciated. And the data we've got, and actually the contextual data that we've got from Busayra, sort of proved that beyond doubt. So I think that too makes the site very significant. And I know Benjamin Porter's more recent work there. I mean, when he was starting work there many years ago, he spoke to me about it and asked if it was okay if they did a new project there. And I always thought that Busayra deserved more work, especially to find out what else was going on in that central part of the site, to check the dating, maybe to get some radiocarbon dating evidence, which Crystal never managed to get, but also to check under the modern town to see, is there anything that we can tell about the extent of the site. And one of the things that Benjamin and his team are doing is working very closely with the local community at Busayra to get them interested in the site, so they have sort of an understanding of the importance of the site, almost feel a sense of ownership of it.
Yeah.
And again, quite unusually for an Iron Age site in Jordan. There's walkways that have been produced around Busayra and information panels, so visitors can come and walk around comfortably and go up and look down at some of the important buildings and have an information panel which explains to them what the context was. And this is something that has come out of Benjamin's work and something that he's continuing to do. And that sort of approach, those sorts of things weren't done in the 1970s and 1980s. And I'm actually delighted that this more community-oriented approach to archaeology is now very important in Jordan. And you can see the results at Busayra.
We had recently attended the presentation of Professor Benjamin Porter at ACOR. It was in February.
That's right. I was listening to it, in fact.
Yeah.
Yes.
I met him in person, and I ran a few articles not only about the presentation but his work, and I'm going to continue to cover his research. How Busayra was economically connected with Wadi Faynan, because you also worked in Wadi Faynan.
Well, I've done most of my research on Faynan has been a sort of analysis of previous projects rather than actually doing my own new field work. But I mean, your question is actually a really important and very interesting one. How was Busayra connected economically to Faynan? If we go back about 25 years before the big excavations at Faynan by Tom Levy and his team, the assumption by everybody was that the major Iron Age copper working at Faynan took place in the late Iron Age, and it would have been contemporary with Busayra and the other Iron Age sites that I've mentioned, like Tawilan and El Biara, and it would have been contemporary with the Arabian trade, which was another aspect of the economy of Iron Age Edom. What was very interesting was that Tom Levy's team found that, on the contrary, the peak of Iron Age production at Faynan was actually in the early Iron Age, and it had finished at least 100 years before Busayra was even founded and before any of the other Iron Age sites in Edom were founded. So what we've actually got, and what we need to remember, is that Faynan is in an environmental setting that's very, very different from Busayra and the other sites. It's what we call the lowlands of Edom, whereas all the other Iron Age sites are what we call the highlands. They're on that plateau on the mountains. So the current thinking is that, in fact, there's little, if any, economic connection between Busayra and Faynan. Tom Levy's team found that there was an attempt to restart Iron Age copper production at Faynan in the late Iron Age, but it looked as if it didn't get very far, and they actually stopped. So what we've got is that in the 10th and 9th centuries, there was a huge expansion of copper production, and that copper was exported as far as the Aegean. But from the early 9th century, you've got a sort of regression at Faynan, and some of the copper production sites, the mines, are being shut. The administrative buildings fall into disuse, or they're used for other things. And by the late 9th century, copper production stops, and it's 100 years then before you get the earliest late Iron Age settlement at Busayra and the other sites. So 25 years ago, my answer to your question would have been, well, copper mining at Faynan is one of the main economic threads that runs through Edom, very important to Busayra. Now, I would say that, well, in fact, copper mining wasn't an important part of the economy of ancient Edom at all. And the economy would have been based largely on the Arabian trade running through, and also on agriculture. So many of the very small sites, including the ones surrounding Busayra, are clearly just farms, a lot of them not very big at all. And they're all absolutely dwarfed by Busayra, which is why I say that it remains a unique site.
Can we say a few words about Arabian trade routes from Yemen to Gaza and Damascus? Because that trade route was very significant for development of Petra and for establishment of Nabatean kingdom, especially after fourth century BC. We're talking about the period from 4th century BC until Nabatean kingdom was annexed by the Roman Empire in 106 AD.
Yes.
And all these states thrived during so-called Arabian incense trade and Arabian trade routes. So in case of Busayra, how Busayra benefited from Arabian trade routes?
Well, at Busayra and the other Edomite Iron Age sites, you've got certain finds that betray Arabian influence and clearly are linked with the burning of incense. In terms of the route, what we need to understand is we don't have an actual road that we know. It was somehow a built road, and we can point to it and point to the evidence of it being constructed and say, oh, look, here the route goes from Arabia and through the side of the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aqaba and up to Busayra and across to the Mediterranean. That's not the sort of evidence we have from the Iron Age. Mostly, you have to reconstruct the route from looking at those sorts of finds that I've talked about that have some sort of Arabian influence. Look at the sites that topographically are on what makes a sensible route, and along a route that was used later on in Nabatean and Roman times, and even later. Because one thing that you find in antiquity is that routes tend to be reused in later periods, and sometimes they are built over, and therefore sometimes evidence of earlier use is lost because of that later construction. So if we piece those bits of evidence together, what we've got is that certainly by the time you get to Jordan, you've got a major site on the Gulf of Aqaba, Tel El Khalifa, very little of which now remains, unfortunately. But the major excavations of that were done in the 1930s by the pioneering American archaeologist Nelson Glick. Some excavations were restarted in the early 2000s by Mary Louise Mussel, but she only managed one season before she died tragically young. And nowadays, most of it has been built over by new development, so there's very little to see now. But that is one of the sites where you have evidence of Arabian interaction. And then at sites like Tawilan and then Busayra, you have the same, and there are a couple of other smaller sites along the way. What's interesting that from Busayra across the Wadi Araba and then through the Beersheba Valley and the Negev, you do actually have some evidence of an ancient route. And there you've got sites in the Negev which have evidence of Edomite presence, showing that this was part of a trade route. You and your listeners probably know there's been a lot of debate for decades about what that Edomite presence at the sites in the Negev meant. And some scholars for many, many years try to explain it as an Edomite invasion of the Negev. The type of evidence we've got there, though, shows that, in fact, these were like trading outposts. And so you would have had Edomites and lots of other people from other areas congregating around some of these key sites in the Negev because they were on the trade route to the Mediterranean Sea. And that is one part of our landscape where we can literally point to a route and say, yes, we can see it went from Busayra through the Wadi Dahal, which does actually have some Iron Age constructions showing that there was a route there, across the Wadi Araba, and then through that network of sites in the Negev, which were trading outposts until it reached the Mediterranean. The port on the Mediterranean, which is most likely, almost certain to have been the main port, it would have been Gaza, but we have very, very little archaeological evidence from Gaza, especially for the Iron Age. And of course, sadly, it's unlikely that we will ever get any more. So there's huge gaps in our knowledge of exactly what happened in that last bit, going from the Negev to the Mediterranean coast. But Gaza was traditionally the main port. We know that there's some Faynan copper ended up earlier in the Iron Age in Egypt. That would have gone through Gaza because that was the main port for Egyptian influence in the late Bronze Age and in the early Iron Age. So we might not be able to prove exactly what was at Gaza in the Iron Age, but it's likely to have been the port.
Regarding Faynan, why the copper industry ceased in 9th century? What was the cause of disruption between other centers and copper mines in Wadi Faynan?
In a sense, I'd start my answer.
Yeah.
I'd start my answer to your question at the other end,
Yeah.
and say, well, why did Faynan copper become so popular in the first place?
Yeah.
And that's likely because the flow of copper from Cyprus, which had traditionally been the main copper producer, and exporting widely across the whole of the Middle East. That ceased, or at least it ceased being exported to the south. More recent research shows that the supply of copper from Cyprus never actually ceased, but maybe it was going more north to what later on became known as Phoenicia and North Syria. But for some reason, when we don't know why, it wasn't coming to the south, and therefore there was a niche for a need for copper that Faynan provided. So certainly from the beginning of the 9th century or the end of the 10th century, the supply of Cypriot copper to the south restarted. We know that. So that will be one element. And also, I referred earlier to the slow sort of regression at Faynan from the early 9th century, the slow sort of ebbing away of administrative control. And in my view, the entity, or the political entity that was responsible for developing early Iron Age copper production at Faynan was the major site of Tel Massos in the Negev. That was abandoned certainly by the mid 9th century, and that's exactly the same time that we've got the closing of some of the mining sites in Faynan, and the ceasing of use of some of the administrative buildings. So I think if you look at it as a whole, you've got the restart of the copper industry, you've got a ceasing of administrative control. So you no longer have people who are there to sort of manage the production, manage the transport, manage the negotiations, the complicated negotiations that you would need to get material to the Mediterranean coast and then exported to the Mediterranean and to the Aegean. So I think it's a complicated scenario, a complicated explanation. There's various things happening, but basically, it seems to me that the evidence is suggesting that Faynan was almost like squeezed. It was squeezed by Cypriot copper, squeezed by the fact that there wasn't anybody managing that production, that transport, that export. And by the end of the 9th century, it just petered out. It didn't come to a dead stop. There was no destruction, nothing like that. It just sort of peters out.
What was the role of nomadic tribes in Edom and in Wadi Faynan during the copper boom in early Iron Age?
Yeah. Well, one thing that I think we have to accept is that in the sort of landscape that we're talking about in Edom, throughout history, there have always been nomadic tribes. They don't always leave a trace that modern archaeologists can find, but they've always been an element. We always need to take them into account, even if we can't see them. One of the oldest archaeological adages is absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and that is absolutely true of nomads in that area. So, as you probably know, the excavators of the copper production at Faynan, Tom Levy and his team, they concluded that it was the local nomads, who actually developed the copper production and produced a sort of nomadic polity, which was unique in the area. And that's since been used as an example of how we can understand how nomads work. That at Faynan, they argue, you can actually see this happening because of the copper, but there will be other areas where we don't have that obvious evidence of copper production, but similar processes may be happening where there's a lot of influence of nomads. And, when they first came up with that hypothesis, I sort of bought it. I agreed with it. I thought, yeah, well, this makes sense. Until I went through their huge 2-volume final report in a lot of detail. And I realized that actually they themselves weren't sure about it. They accepted in their report that they saw no link between the nomads from one of the nomadic cemeteries in Faynan and the actual copper production. And they concluded that, well, one of two things may be happening. Maybe either this copper production was created by nomads, or there was an external entity that that came in and influenced it. And they never actually pursued that second idea. They just said, but we're going to go with the first hypothesis and we're going to develop it. And if you go through the final report, you'll realize that actually there is nothing to suggest that nomads were responsible for the copper production, and especially this huge boom. And that's why in more recent work, I've suggested that the site of Telmassos, which did have expertise in copper, it had expertise in transport and export, and it had links with all sorts of far-flung areas through trade. I suggested that it was Telmassos that was responsible for this. Nevertheless, nomads would have had a role, because we know that a lot of the sites in the Negev in the early Iron Age were settled, and the likelihood is that the nomads there were working in transporting the copper from Faynan to the Mediterranean. So I think we can agree that nomads did have a role, but what they were not is responsible for actually creating this huge industrial boom. The huge industrial boom came because of the impact of an external entity, Telmassos, but then they needed people to work in transporting the copper, and that was something that the local nomadic tribes were able to do. And we can see archaeological evidence linking the nomadic sites with Faynan, because some of their pottery actually comes from Faynan. So you can almost see the trail through the Negev highlands of these nomadic tribes as they moved the copper towards the Mediterranean.
And because we're approaching the end, I wish you good luck in your next season. We're going to excavate in 2025.
Well, this is a survey. This is a project called Mountaintop Sites in Edom, which I am directing together with Professor Katharina Schmidt of Munster University. And we're looking at the Iron Age sites, which are on mountaintops in Edom. And traditionally, these have been described as inaccessible and temporary refuges for pastoralist tribes. A lot of people have said, we don't understand why they would have settled on these. They're inaccessible. They don't have water. They don't have agricultural resources. These can only be temporary bolt holes for people to escape to. And what we've been doing is surveying every single one of these mountaintop sites, and especially the routes to them and the water resources and the agricultural resources. And we are actually coming up with an alternative explanation. And we are saying, well, A, these aren't inaccessible at all. There is a network of perfectly easy and accessible tracks to every single one of them. And we've identified and mapped all of those. They all have access to water. They're all within easy reach of springs. Yes, some of them have cisterns on top to capture rainwater, but they all have springs fairly close. and they are all within areas where there are agricultural resources and fields that are at most within an hour's walk from the site. And sometimes you have garden or field areas actually within the sites themselves. So instead of the older interpretation that these were inaccessible refuges, what we're suggesting is that these were self-sufficient agricultural sites, actually over several generations, because at least one of them has a whole burial cairn field, huge burial cairn field, including some massive graves, which are clearly for more than one person, maybe for a family. And the number of them, you could see this must have been several generations being buried here. So I think we've got a different insight into what these sites were and how they functioned. And interestingly, going back to where we started from, Busayra, they don't seem to be connected to the major trade routes of the Arabian trade. They have a very different material culture from Busayra. And so we can come back to the question of, well, in what sense was Busayra the capital of Edom? And I think what more recent work is showing is that, yes, Busayra was a major administrative center. It was a place where you had somebody who was recognized, at least by the Assyrians and Babylonians, as a king. But actually the reach of Busayra, the power of Busayra, the influence of Busayra probably didn't reach very far. And elsewhere in Edom, where you've got contemporary settlement, that actually had nothing to do with Busayra. They weren't really under the influence of a king. They maybe didn't even know they had a king. And they certainly weren't connected, as far as we can see, to the Arabian trade. So you've got these sites on mountaintops, which were self-sufficient agricultural settlements within what perhaps geographically we understand as Edom, but they probably wouldn't have identified themselves as Edomite at all. So that's what I'm doing in a couple of weeks' time.
In a couple of weeks' time, and I'm going
Yes,
to
that's right.
send you questions about that as well.
Okay, I look forward to
I'm
that.
looking forward to gaining more material from you and Dr. Schmidt, a friend of mine. Especially, we collaborated very well when she was the director of German Protestant Institute of Archaeology.
Right, yes.
I wish you successful survey. I wish you
Thank you very much.
successful work.
Thank
And
you.
we're
It's
going
been
to
great talking
continue
to
our
you.
conversation. This is just the initial talk between us, and we're going to talk more about your research. All the best.
That'll be fun. I look forward to it very much.
Thank you so much. All the best.
Okay, thank you. You too.
Bye.
Bye.